For technology as a system general idea today, numerous conceptions of system exist. 35. Most authors start with the object to be studied and define the system in terms of that object. Deutsch, quoted by Hammond, calls a system an ensemble of parts or subsystems which interact in such a way that the components tend to change slowly enough to be provisionally treated as constants. These slowly changing parts can be called structures, if the exchanges occurring in their mutual relationships prove to be oriented towards maintaining or reproducing systems. They can be called functions. Hammond specifies a set of rational elements, whose evolution is characterized mainly by feedback, but he points out that this is the feedback of the whole on the parts, which assures the autonomy of the system in the whole of reality. Thus, the system is not a collection of objects placed side by side, nor a nonspecific aggregate. Many authors overlabor feedback as the true key to the system. In contrast, Henry Lefebvre stresses only the difference between the whole and the sum of the parts. A system is a set of relationships that add something to the sum of the diverse elements. That is why we can speak of the principle of the isomorphism of the system. Very different elements can have homologous energy laws. In other words, a system is a totality having its own laws of structure. And in this way, aggregates always appear as subordinates. However, Lefebvre draws the contestable idea that a system evolves purely in terms of its own internal logic. And for Meadows in the Rome Report, the structure of any system, i.e. the relations between elements, numerous, forming interlocking loops, and sometimes with effects that are staggered in time, is as important in the evolution of the system as the nature of each individual element making it up. Finally, there is Talcott Parsons' definition, the social system, 1951. Two or more entities make up a system if they are linked in such a way that a change of state in the first is followed by a change of state in the other, which, in turn, is followed by a new change in the first. This definition certainly characterizes an aspect of the technological system, but it is really too vague. In any case, the facet of Parsons' thinking that applies especially well to the technological system is the idea that a system is inevitably both integrating and integrated, or rather, a structural organization of the interaction between units. It involves a model, an equilibrium, a system of control. I would like to single out several features in Parsons. The system is a set of elements interrelating in such a way that any evolution of one triggers a revolution of the whole, and any modification of the whole has repercussions on each element. Thus, quite plainly, we are by no means dealing with isolated objects, but rather with a network of interrelations. It is also obvious that the factors making up the system are not identical in nature. There are, for instance, quantitative and non-quantitative elements. Finally, it is certain that the individual factors do not all change at the same rate. The system has its specific process and speed of change in relation to the parts, just as it has its special laws of development and transformation. The second feature that I would like to emphasize is the following. The elements composing the system have a sort of preferential disposition to combine among themselves rather than with outside factors. The economic system implies a preferential relationship, which involves both a tendency to change for internal reasons and a resistance to external influences. The third feature is obviously that a system able to be grasped at a moment of its composition is nevertheless dynamic. The interrelations between the parts are not of the same type as those between the parts of an engine, which do act upon one another and in terms of one another, but always keep repeating the same action. In a system, the acting factors modify the other elements, and the action is not repetitive but constantly innovative. The interrelations create an evolution. The system never coagulates, albeit remaining a system and recognizably System X, even after many evolutions. The fourth feature is that a system existing as a totality can enter into relationships with other systems, other totalities. Finally, it is common knowledge that one of the essential traits of a system is the feedback, or rather the feedback structures, which do not, however, make up the system itself. A system is thus characterized by two elements. On the one hand, the interrelations between the principal and significant elements of the whole, which, incidentally, can thus never be tested, all things being equal. On the other hand, its organic relationship to the outside. A system in the social sciences is necessarily open. It can never be considered in itself to the exclusion of any other relationship. If I choose the term system to describe technology in present-day society, it is certainly not because the word is fashionable now, but because I feel that it fits technology. It is an indispensable tool for understanding what is meant by technology, while disregarding the spectacular, the curious, the epiphenomena that make observation impossible. Take medicine. Once, especially in the past, doctors described ideal models of diseases, but each concrete case of typhus did not show all the hallmarks listed in books as belonging to the abstract disease and ending with paroxysm and death. Yet if the physician had not had that schema of the abstract disease, which was obtained by eliminating all secondary elements of chance, he would never have been able to tell that a set of symptoms corresponded to typhus. The system thus involves a choice of symptoms, factors, and analysis of their relationships. But this is not a mere intellectual construction. There is quite definitely such a thing as a system, just as there was a disease expressed in a correlation between the systems that could be grouped and labeled. Technology has now become so specific that we have to consider it in itself and as a system. 36. By speaking of the technological system, I propose to take account of an important part of reality. This is no simple hypothesis of an aleatory development. I am not extrapolating from a curve while singling out quantitative data from the past in a particular sector. At the moment, technology, in its qualitative and quantitative aspects, has developed in such a way that we can conceive its normal development. There is a logic which makes the system. Consequently, I propose to take reality into account by analyzing this system and its evolution. But obviously, I cannot do so with full certainty, for the technological system is not completed. It is not closed. It is not a system evolving by its own unique internal logic. Thus, it includes not only a large margin of chance, but also a large portion of probability. It is no use forecasting technological inventions. In 1990, we'll have this and that, etc., for prophecies can be made only after an overall study of the system as such, not by totting up countless innovations and applications. Finally, to the extent that it is not repetitive, the technological system, while giving us only one case to study, is more difficult than physical, ecological systems, etc., which have repeated cycles that can be observed. 37. The technological system is formed by the existence of the technological phenomenon and by technological advance. I am using technological phenomenon in the sense that I gave it in the technological society, distinguishing it from technological operation, which has always existed throughout history. 38. The technological phenomenon has been specific to Western civilization since the 18th century. 39. It is characterized by consciousness, criticalness, rationality. 40. I will not come back to that. But the technological phenomenon does not suffice per se to make up the system. In fact, it can be regarded as essentially static. One may be tempted to take the phenomenon as such, and that being the case to consider and analyze it. 41. In so doing, one would not only be making the habitual error of this kind of cut at a given moment, one would also miss the system itself, which, as a system, is evolutionary. But I have to make myself clear. I do not mean that objects or the technological system are evolving. That goes without saying. It is an obvious fact and it does not add anything. Everyone knows that the automobiles of 1970 are not those of 1930, but that does not make the technological object, or more generally, the phenomenon, any different from any pebble. We have said that the technological system is made up of the phenomenon and of progression. The latter is not the modification or evolution of the object. yet we are always tempted to think it is those things. Everything flows, time goes by, hence, the object changes. One might almost say that evolution depends on that passing of time, a kind of force exterior to the object, a river bathing it and carrying it away. But with technology, we are dealing with a totally different reality, for it is technology that works its own change. It has what Juvenal calls a permanent revolution of processes. Progression is a part of the object itself. It is constitutive to the object. As we have said, there is no technology without progression. Technological progress is not evolving technology. It is not technological objects that change because they are improved. It is not an adding up of influences on those machines or those organizations that impels them to adjust. Technology has as a specific given the feature that it requires its own transformation for itself. From the very instant that it existed in its modern reality, it produced the phenomenon of progression. The progress with which we are imbued and whose ideology inspires all our judgments is a direct result of technology. It is not technology progressing. It is a new and independent reality. It is the conjunction of the technological phenomenon and technological progress that constitutes the technological system. Hence, there are traits, regulations, laws, if one can still phrase it thus, in both. Technological progress takes place in a certain way and offers peculiarities distinguishing it from other types of evolution. Economic growth or cultural development does not happen along the same lines as technological progression. Therefore, the technological system is characterized by a set of specific traits that distinguish it from other verifiable systems. 42. As for the singularity of this system, it reveals itself in the very circumstance that a technological factor always preferentially joins with another technological factor. An attraction exists between them, and it is clearly due not to the nature of either factor but to their belonging to the same system. Hence, the associations with external factors, depending on other systems political, economic, ideological are certainly not excluded, but they are always secondary. Of course, in employing the word system, I do not mean that technology is alien to the other environments political, economic, etc. Technology is not a closed system, but it is a system in that each technological factor, a certain machine, for instance, is first linked to, connected with, dependent on, the ensemble of other technological factors before it relates to non-technological elements. Or rather, to the extent that technology has become an environment, each technological factor is situated in that environment and constitutes it by subsisting on it. There is a system just as one can say that cancer is a system. There is a similar mode of action in all the points at which the cancer manifests itself in the organism. There is a proliferation of a new tissue in regard to the old tissue, and there is a relationship between the metastases. A cancer within another living system is itself an organism but incapable of surviving on its own. The same holds true for the technological system. On the one side, it can appear, develop, exist only to the extent that it integrates into a social body existing apart from it. One cannot conceive of technology like nature, as able to live on its own. Social nature is pre-existent to the technological system, which finds its integration, its possibilities, its support in social nature. Yet on the other side, the growth of technology does not leave the social body intact, nor does it allow its various elements to develop by and of themselves. For instance, there is no family per se, which, thanks to technology, would change as a family and find a new familial equilibrium. In reality, the technological impact challenges the totality of the family as a fact. The family is no longer a sociological reality attached to the body social in order to depend above all on the technological system. The family has now become the family in the technological environment. What is more, each technological factor is not first bound up with some group, some economic or social phenomenon. It is primarily integrated into the technological system. Hence, the mechanization of office work. The current idea is that the government administration office's complex remains dominant, and technology is integrating into it. An extra technological element is added to the bureaucratic organization, integrated into the administrative mechanism, and attached to this activity. Such a view of things obviously leads to regarding technology as put together out of disparate bits and pieces, with random and uncertain relations between them. Yet the opposite is true. Each technological element is associated with all the others preferentially. And when mechanization is introduced into offices, it is a kind of spearhead launched in that direction by the technological system. Administration is then modified. Above all, it loses its determining character and is now determined by the new apparatus. Unity is achieved not so much in the earlier framework government administration, but by means of the correlations between the diverse technologies. Thus, there are no scattered technological factors, integrated into various social, political, economic contexts, which have their organizational principles, their unity, etc. quite the reverse. There is a technological system having various modalities of intervention and attaching to itself every fragment of the human or social reality, which operation, moreover, removes that fragment from the tissue it was a part of. Hence, every technological factor, associated with the others, forms a more or less coherent and doubtlessly rigorous whole. The coherence is internal but not necessarily evident. Defining the system, we will have to show at length in what way technology is a system and how that system functions. But in this paragraph, we can offer a general justification of this undertaking. Total technization occurs when every aspect of human life is subjected to control and manipulation, to experimentation and observation, so that a demonstrable efficiency is achieved everywhere. 44. The system is revealed in the change, a technological, social change, mobility, adjustment, etc., a necessary change for continuously solving the problems raised more and more swiftly by the very existence of technology, owing to the interdependence of all the components, owing to the totality and, finally, the stability attained. This last point is particularly essential. Detechnicization is impossible. The scope of the system is such that we cannot hope to go back. If we attempted a detechnicization, we would be like primitive forest dwellers setting fire to their native environment. These four traits of technology offer a first glimpse of what may be called the system from an overall vantage point. However, Simondon has shown that the technological object requires a separate treatment to be understood and for the whole to be grasped. The problem posed by Simondon, namely the specific knowledge of the technological object, shows that there is a system from which that object cannot be divorced. The technological object must be taken in the totality of its relations, and genetically. According to Simondon, the mode of existence of technological objects is definite because it proceeds from a genesis. But this genesis creates not only objects, it creates first a technological reality, then a general technicity. It is the ensemble, the interconnection of technologies, that makes this both natural and human polytechnical universe. In existence, for the natural world and for the human world, the technologies are not separated. However, for technological thinking, they are virtually separated, because there does not exist a thinking developed highly enough to permit theorizing about this technical network of concrete ensembles. Beyond technical determinations and norms, we would have to discover polytechnical and technological determinations and norms. There exists a world of the plurality of technologies, with its own peculiar structures. Simondon considers this the true task of philosophy. It strikes us that the philosopher in general, for Simondon manages to demonstrate the opposite, is rather ill-equipped to proceed toward this discovery. In reality, the discovery would be of an artificial universe to be taken on its own terms, in its own specificity. The technological object, becoming detachable, can be grouped with other technological objects according to such and such an arrangement. The technological world offers an indefinite availability of groupings and connections. Constructing a technological object means preparing an availability. The industrial grouping is not the only one to be realized with technological objects. We can also realize non-productive groupings, whose goal is to attach man to nature through a regulated concatenation of organized mediations, to create a coupling between human thought and nature. The technological world intervenes here as a system of convertibility. Thus, this technological system exists not only by its intrinsic relationship, but also because the objects to which the technologies are applied are systems themselves. Nature, society. Since nature and society have existed as systems, the ecosystem, for instance, technology applied to separated, specified, differentiated aspects of the one and then of the other, has finally covered them in their entirety. But these parceling operations, the correspondence of a technology to, or the creation of a technological object for, a certain natural need, a certain natural challenge, had an interrelationship, owing not to their technological qualification at the outset, but to their application to systems. It was only gradually with the acquisition of second and degree technologies, that technology, constituted as a veritable continuous tissue, then as an environment became, in turn, a system in itself, independent of its objects. At that moment the technologies became coherent with respect to one another, they were organized in terms of one another. The elements, the technological factors, were not simply juxtaposed, they combined with one another. An ensemble was established, of solidarities, connections, coordination among all the objects, methods, etc. of technology. We must, however, pinpoint something here. When I speak of a system, I do not mean that I am constructing a system intended for descriptive and operational analysis and based on simulation by a data processing model. I could say that, to a certain extent, I am applying systemic analysis to a concrete ensemble, but rather, I believe I can establish that the technological phenomena have combined in such a way as to now present the characteristics of a truly existing system. The goal is not to formalize in terms of a computer processing, but rather to establish a certain reality, by no means every reality, which allows setting up the theory. Indeed, one thing struck me very sharply. The formalized systems I investigated were all very weak conceptually and very poor in understanding facts, all of which rendered them utterly inadequate. The operations issuing thence, perfect as they may be on a mathematical level, therefore made little sense. It seems to me that the limit of application depends on the size of the object. I feel that this method is applicable to precise and relatively limited objects, an organization or an ensemble of organizations, with the study of the pertinent system of information and system of decision. 45. But I feel just as strongly that this is impossible for an entire society, for Western economy as a whole, or for, say, the general politics of Europe. At most, the formalization into a system here could best reveal what is not possible as interpretation. In this book, however, I tend far more to share Parsons' outlook in his The Social System. But we have to face a serious criticism. How can we deal with technology as though it had a kind of existence in itself? How can we analyze a technological system as a sort of clock running all by itself? Technology exists only because there are human beings participating in it, making it function, inventing, choosing. To claim we can examine technology without regarding the chance elements, the irregularities produced by man, means proceeding to an illegitimate and moreover impossible abstraction. The technological system is purely imaginary, we never see it. What we see, what we encounter are men using the instruments. Ultimately, technology does not exist. There are products, there are machines, there are methods, but it is artificial to view them together. Lefebvre wants to show that there are plural technologies, diverse, mutually unrelated and plural technological objects, scattered, dispersed, with very divergent finalities and never concerning the same environments. There is thus a collection, an addition, but no system. I realized that by analyzing the technological system as an object in itself, without considering mankind or groups, I am going counter to one of the chief trends in present-day sociology. Weber is reproached for studying bureaucracy as a system, setting forth its traits and operating laws. His detractors point out that it is the officials, the clerks that count, and that, ultimately, no concrete investigation reveals any of the laws and principles forwarded by Weber. Instead, we find human relationships, actions and reactions of groups and individuals, dysfunctions, choices, and initiatives. That and nothing else is the verifiable reality of an administration. That is man in relation to what is known as technology. It is he who, in the final analysis, is called upon to act and to choose. Even if there is a certain reality of technology, it is erroneous to claim we can analyze it by disregarding the human presence. 46. And yet, although I am familiar with this objection and acknowledge its full accuracy, such an analysis is precisely what I have attempted here. And my reasons are twofold. First of all, to say that one sees only separate technological objects which do not form a system is, with all due respect, a limited attitude. When man, looking at the things of nature, finds only separate objects, clouds and grass, pebbles and water, etc., all of them scattered and unrelated, one cannot call this a very satisfying intellectual position. We know that from his very origins, man has tried to establish a system of nature. He has striven for both a system of relations and an explanatory system. He has often gone awry, with magical or metaphysical explanations and correspondences, but each time, one system replaced another, until he formulated a system of rational relationships that are called scientific. This is precisely the same labor that we have attempted here. We do not claim that our description of the technological system is scientific or decisive, but only that this is an indispensable first step, without which nothing can be done toward comprehending man's new universe. Furthermore, when omitting human dysfunctions, my attitude is simply that of the scientist who assumes all things being equal, whereas we know very well that such a situation will never exist. Likewise, we know very well that in chemistry and physics, the analysis of a phenomenon must perforce disregard certain conditions. One comes to a law, but when one tries to experiment, the experiment never exactly supplies what was foreseen, because the disregarded factors are not absent in reality. Yet if researchers did not proceed in this way, no science would be possible. To discern the phenomenon itself, to know its regularities, we have to detach it artificially from variables, hazards, accidental disturbances. If we realize that these variables are nevertheless always present in reality, we need only reintegrate them and consider, on the basis of the first analysis, the modifications thus occurring in the phenomenon. What is well known for the so-called exact sciences must also be applied to the social sciences. Marx's attitude toward political economy strikes me as exemplary. Those whom he called the economists, i.e., the classic ones, the liberals, the founders of economic science, had indeed disregarded the human factor. Marx did not say that they were wrong or that their analysis of economy was therefore inaccurate. On the contrary, he ceaselessly used their analysis, and he looked upon their results as scientifically correct. But he then asserted that it is impossible to leave out the human factor from the economic milieu, and that we must see what its reinsertion will bring about. Even more, he drew conclusions about the economic reality because it was possible to study it scientifically by eliminating the human factor, and he went on to a critique of political economy based on the very data supplied by the classical economists. Their previous work was indispensable. The same holds true for Weber and bureaucracy. The study of dysfunctions and the analysis of employee behavior is impossible without Weber's schematic construction. It would be wrong to say that bureaucracy is exclusively the system taken apart by Weber, but it is just as wrong to say that bureaucracy is exclusively an ensemble of human relations, pressures, interests, etc. These have meaning or even a possibility of existence only to the extent that this ensemble is situated in, and in terms of, this objective system. What would those human relations mean if one did not know in advance that they are integrated in an ensemble of regulations, examinations, hierarchies, jurisdictions that are objectively established, and that one must first become familiar with and determine, before knowing what, in this context, is the reality experienced by human beings? One should not protest that there is no reality but what is experienced, that only the accepted as, the understood as are what count, with nothing existing beyond that experience. This is certainly accurate, but for such an experience to exist, there must be a reality outside that experience. I refuse to get entangled in philosophical debate. I am only saying that the official can experience the civil service examination as. But the fact that the examination is laid down by a law giving it its reality, that there are rules of application, a designated jury, etc. Well, this ensemble exists, not so much prior to the experience, nor as the occasion of the experience, but by itself. Of course, it is experienced only through a series of personal or collective experiences and perceptions. But it cannot be reduced to that, for if these laws and rules did not exist, there would be no experiences or perceptions. And it is not useless to know what the object is. In other words, by studying the technological system, I appear to be disregarding man, but in fact, I am showing the canvas on which action, refusal, angst, approval, perception, etc. take place. And without knowing that canvas, I could not understand those experiences and perceptions. Thus, I propose to furnish not so much the reality as a certain given that is indispensable for knowing this reality. To be sure, these matters have no objective reality independent of man's experience, but what man experiences does not boil down to his subjectivity. We have to bear in mind the rules imposed upon him, the obstacles he comes up against, etc. It is only if I know the wording of the law that I can understand a specific interpretation, a specific behavior of obeying or flouting. Thus, in describing the system, I do not exclude the initiatives and choices of individuals, but only the possibility that everything boils down to them. I do not offer what takes place, what is, but what man modifies, accelerates, disturbs, etc. Nonetheless, there is a further error to be avoided here. We should not believe that if technology is considered in this way, it is an object, or that, in relation to technology, man is a subject. Yet that is what we hear all the time. After all, technology merely supplies things, and man does whatever he likes with them. Thus, everything depends on their good or bad use. Remarkably, moreover, the very same people declare that the technological system does not exist as such and that there are only technological objects. In point of fact, however, those objects are not scattered and unrelated, they are included in a system. Furthermore, man, who is to act upon this system, who is to use these technological objects, is not a man per se, an absolute subject either. He himself is incorporated in a technological society. We have to zero in on this current opinion. First of all, it belongs to the man in the street, who of course does not perceive a technological ensemble. He thinks he is dealing with his car, his TV, his modern accounting register, the IBM machine, and the airplane. Separate elements, distinct uses, an absence of reflection on their coherence and continuity. But this attitude results just as much from specialization. Each sector develops independently of the others, in appearance. Each of us is immersed in a separate technological domain. Each man knows his professional technology, and only that. He is aware, theoretically, that other technologies exist side by side with his, but he does not see the inner coherence of the sectors, and he can dream about all those vast and free fields which are ruled by independence and imagination, his own field being that of rigor, efficiency, and enslavement. Last but not least, among intellectuals, this attitude results from a systematic refusal to consider this reality. If technology is truly a system, then freedom of thought is a mere decoy, man's sovereignty is threatened, etc. And since this cannot be, then technology cannot possibly be a system. This panicky reflex dominates most intellectual judgments on the non-existence of technology per se. It is really so convenient and so reassuring to consider only completely unrelated devices, objects, methods. One can then imagine sovereign man throning in this collection and acting upon it in full independence. All technological elements come from him, have no existence outside of him, and return to him. In short, man gives them their coherence. For there is great reluctance to admit that a specific organization of technology exists, relatively independent of man, a sort of schematizing of life by technology. This reluctance is manifest in the following romantic reactions, which explains a whole portion of modern literature, the intellectual impugnment of this possibility, and the elaboration of false concepts to account for our society, to attest that ultimately nothing has changed. Man is still man, society is still society, nature is still nature. Society is still formally and substantially the same, i.e., nothing has essentially changed in 2 centuries. Of course, there is speed, urbanization, and so on, but at bottom, those intellectuals maintain the image of an intact society and an intact human being, a society whose structures are comparable to those of the past, not the same, to be sure, whose groups, culture, work are subject to the same principles and the same analyses, though we perceive the differences, to be sure. Society, the same old society, is thought of as consisting still of classes with similar class relationships and obeying the same old dialectics. In other words, there is a permanent reality undergoing surface modifications, the reality of man for some, the reality of society for others, the reality of classes. And this reality is joined by an ensemble of processes, objects, work methods, machines, which certainly change 1 or 2 aspects of the society, but ultimately integrate into it, add to it. This image recurs endlessly, even among the most forward-looking people, the image of a modern society, which, in short, is merely the traditional society plus technologies. Naturally, it is not put in that way, but the type of analysis presented shows that such is the hidden assumption. And that is exactly what Lefebvre assumes in the statement quoted above. It is very hard to accept that we live in a society having no common measure with earlier societies, and that the experiences and thoughts of our ancestors are no longer of any use to us. Far more interesting and attractive is the phenomenon known as rapid change, a term widely used in Christian studies, the World Council of Churches, etc. This notion is wrong from 2 points of view. First of all, this term focuses on the rapidity of change in a previously known factor, e.g. the family. There is a state A, a state B, a state C of the family, and we are told that the present transition from state B to C is far swifter than the earlier transition from A to B, but this problem is quite secondary. The issue is much less the rapid evolution of old elements than the appearance of a structure and an ensemble of radically new functions. From a moral or humanist point of view, we must certainly deal with the concrete fate of the individuals and groups affected by rapid change. But so long as we consider the latter first, we doom ourselves to understanding nothing of that issue. We have to regard not so much the change of older frameworks as the appearance of a new environment. We have to highlight not so much the urban transformation as man's situation in the technological structures. The second aspect of the same error crops up when we consider the origin of the concept of rapid change, which results from a particularly strong impression of some striking event. People produce more, people go faster, etc. Rapid change concerns the spectacle aspect of our society. It implies that we do not stick to the purely factual event. On the contrary, the essential thing is to focus on the overall mutation resulting from the appearance of the technological system. The instant one actually grasps what that means, the sensational discoveries lose much of their interest. Walking on the moon is no longer an event. It is a reasonable and normal consequence of what already exists. We can then say that once the technological system becomes the structure of our society, we can no longer speak of rapid change, but rather of normal, foreseeable, and almost unilinear consequences of the previous mutation. That is why we find it necessary to reject the concept of rapid change, which is a red herring. The technological system is a qualitatively different phenomenon from an addition of multiple technologies and objects. We cannot absolutely understand them if we consider them separately or isolate one field of action from technology. We have to study them inside of, and in terms of, the overall technological system. How could we evaluate the influence of rapid communications if we separate them from the methods of modern work, the forms of housing, the technologies of government and administration, the demands of production and distribution, etc.? The mere act of isolating one aspect completely falsifies the issue as a whole. To understand the technological phenomenon, to analyze its sociology, the first condition is to regard it as a whole, in its unity. So long as we look at the technologies separately, we can certainly study each one's formation, its specific methods, its particular influences. But that sheds no light for us on the society in which we live or on the reality of the technological milieu. We would therefore have a false view of not only the whole, but also every particular technology, for each one can be truly comprehended only in its relationship to the others. To what extent does that one technology spark the development of other technologies? To what extent is it based on other technologies, etc.? This is a decisive methodological problem. We have to study the technological system in itself, and it is only this approach that makes it possible to study the different technologies. That leads to rejecting what I will call abstract empiricism, already abundantly criticized by Sorokin and Mills, i.e., the attitude of abstracting one aspect, retaining only that, and sticking to the most immediate reality as the object of study, applying exact methods to it. Obviously, the mathematical method, statistics, surveys, can be useful only for limited and quite subordinate facets, and such an investigation should certainly be launched. But when it is done, we ought to know that it is neither the faithful report nor the exact interpretation of the whole, that it must not claim any privileged or preeminent explanatory position. If it is not part of an analysis of the overall reality, of a description of the general correlations, it will mislead anyone who trusts the results, for it lacks the essential, the interactions. Having said that, we can attempt a quick first view of this system by naming certain of its aspects. The first aspect of the system is obviously its specificity. Technologies are not comparable to anything else. That which is not a technology has no point in common with that which is, and they possess, among themselves, similar characteristics. One can find traits common to all technologies, but we have to go further. All the parts are correlated, a correlation accentuated by the technicizing of information. The consequences are twofold. First of all, one cannot modify a technology without causing repercussions and modifications in a huge number of other objects or methods. Secondly, the combinations of technologies produce technological effects, engendering new objects or new methods, and these combinations take place necessarily, inevitably. But beyond that, the technological world, like any system, has a certain tendency to regulate itself, i.e., to constitute an order of development and functioning which makes technology engender both its own accelerators and its own brakes. Nevertheless, as we shall see, this aspect is the most uncertain. The system thus seems highly independent of man, just as the natural environment used to be. This system exists basically not because a mechanical relationship has established itself between the different factors. By no means should we imagine the technological system like the different parts of a clockwork, but because we have a denser and denser ensemble of information relationships. We already know this on the level of our own interpretation. Information theory, which is all the rage nowadays, is an interscientific technology that allows us both to systematize scientific concepts and schematize diverse technologies. Information theory is not a new science, nor a technology among technologies. It has developed because the technological system exists as a system by dint of the relationships of information. It is neither a chance thing nor a brilliant human discovery. It is a response to man's need to understand the new universe. Information theory is a mediating thought among the various technologies, but also among the various sciences, and between the sciences and the technologies. It comes into play as a science of technologies and a technology of sciences. But if that is so, if information theory now appears to be a means of finally penetrating that system, then it is because information has done its share in structuring the system itself. The various technologies have unified into a system by dint of the information transmitted from one to another and utilized technologically in each sector. One can fittingly apply Norbert Wiener's statement, cybernetics, to the technological system. Just as the amount of information of a system measures its degree of organization, so too the entropy of a system measures its degree of disorganization. Once every technological object or method no longer had just the function of doing the exact task it was created for, but also acted as a transmitter of information. Once every technological object or method started not only to function as such, but also to register the information transmitted by the whole technological environment, aside from what comes from the natural environment. And finally, once everyone took all that information into account, that was the point at which there was a system. It is not only the emergence of information theory which forces us to note this, but also the multiplication of devices transmitting information and of information technologies. The technological system has thus become a demander in these areas. The more technology develops, the further the labors of information increase as a condition of that development. Material output and the movements of physical objects have become less important than these non-material activities. The information explosion was necessary for the creation of the system. It is not a mere accidental product of our capacity to produce information. The moment the system tends to organize itself, the demand for information becomes explicit. That is to say, a new informational sector appears, which is itself made up of technologies whose sole specific feature is to produce, transmit, and gather information. At present, 90% of this information is produced by technologies of action and intervention, and its purpose is to allow other technological sectors to improve or adjust. Thus, what we have is an intertechnological relationship, the emergence of an ensemble of mediations, and that is what constitutes technology into a system. It is not just a matter of, though this is important, communicating and reading about scientific discoveries, innovations, the international grid of information that will integrate the present-day electronic databanks, for instance. Far more significant is the permanent relation, on a concrete, often very humble level, between everything that is performed and everything that could be performed in the neighboring operational areas. Scientific information has always been highly attractive and unsettling, but it is not the center of our world. It is the permanent movement of thousands of bits of operational data from one technological sector to another. Now this movement has been decisively facilitated by the appearance of computers, and it is in this context that we must ask about the new technological ensemble, thanks to which the technological system is completing the process of constituting itself. The importance of the computer is obviously tied to the fact that the further we advance, the more significant a part of our world information becomes. This is already a platitude. We are no longer a society dominated by the imperative of production. Now, we are ruled by the transmission, circulation, reception, and interpretation of multiple information. And that is exactly how the system is completing its constitution. The parts are not coordinated or even connected with one another. They are not materially linked, but each part is a receiver of information, and the system is held together by the network of endlessly renewed information. What makes it flexible and ungraspable at a given moment is that one can never draw up any sort of inventory of the system, because that would mean coagulating the information, hence negating the system itself. The computer is an enigma, not in its making or its usage, but because man appears incapable of foreseeing anything about the computer's influence on society and humanity. We have most likely never dealt with such an ambiguous apparatus, an instrument that seems to contain the best and the worst, and above all, a device whose true potentials we are unable to scrutinize. Naturally, we know what a computer can be employed for directly. There is no need to run through its possible uses here. This is not part of our investigation. I will merely recall a few acknowledged facts. The machine does not do everything. Man must first define the goal, the objective to be attained, on condition that it can be evaluated quantitatively, decide on a program to put into the machine's memory, and translate the program into a language that the computer can understand, and gather the specific data of the problem to be solved. The machine performs the operations and presents the results, but it is man who decides what he will do with the results. The machine cannot, in theory, we will see the discussion below, surpass its own limits or take initiatives. It functions according to rules that are defined in advance. By using the computer, man, admittedly, can pass along inferior, automatic tasks, and it is inferred that he can therefore devote himself to the superior tasks of inventing, of conceiving programs. But we can stop here in this recollection of platitudes. Instantly, we are confronted with the apparently insoluble questions, an extreme controversy among researchers. And it is this division, in which I find it impossible to discern a reason for choosing one stance over another, that strikes me as attesting the true unknowability of the computer on the simplest level. Will the computer cause unemployment? For some, this is indisputable, since whole job categories are going to be brutally displaced. One computer doing the work of 50 or 100 men. But then again, building, maintaining, and programming these machines will require considerable manpower. A program taking only a few seconds to be answered will necessitate months of elaboration by a team of workers. But between those two outlooks, we are absolutely unable to arrive at any choice, for we have no concrete experience. One can merely put forward that all technological progress brings unemployment and some jobs to make up for it, although these new jobs will not be taken by the people who are thrown out of work. What does seem certain is that the computer will accentuate the predominance of technicians, highly qualified employees, and the young, and it will make the skills of old and unretrainable employees useless at a faster and faster clip. Another insoluble problem crops up. Is the computer going to bring about centralization, or will it permit decentralization? 47. The computer accelerates decision-making and modifies the areas of centralization and decentralization. The centralization of means, the coordination of decision-making power in one point, the coherence of decisions, which postulates centralization. The integrated processing allows analyzing the procedure of decision-making in its coherence. Storage procedures permit centralizing all the useful facts at one single point. Hence, one can perfectly visualize a single center of political power. The data banks award a decisive superiority to the group that runs them. It could discuss an economic plan drawn up by the authorities, on the basis of millions of facts that the group alone would know, and that would be processed by computers that the group alone would possess. But in contrast, other authors state that the computer is a marvelous instrument for decentralizing. Open the data banks to everyone, and everyone will be able to discuss politics with means hitherto unknown. The centralization of decision-making is necessary only to the extent that coordination and impetus demand it. In all other cases, the centralization of data processing can combine with a decentralization of decision-making. Decentralization is not only possible but facilitated. The computer relieves the decentralized collectivities of all-absorbing tasks and increases their decision-making power by augmenting their means of information, data processing coordinates, and hence reinforces the decentralized system, which, moreover, will soon be made necessary by the congestion of the center. 48. The consoling thing in such a discussion is that once again we seem to be dealing in everything and for everything, with a simple orientation of man himself. Hence, whether the data banks are opened up for everyone or kept shut and reserved for only a few is a simple matter of human decision. If man wants, the data processing system can be an instrument of dictatorship or democracy. Alas, as we shall see, it is not all that simple. Let us discuss one final question, the most central and apparently insoluble: the limits of the computer, or even the total replacement of man. Will the computer remain a simple inert instrument, which man can do with as he pleases, or will the robot seize its autonomy and replace man? This would be an evolution which Larry Gerhan interprets as man creating endlessly outside of himself something that acts in his stead, and thus makes human action useless. With the computer, we are reaching the final stage of that replacement. Man's mind is becoming unnecessary. Technology is a process of exteriorizing human capacities, and the final step has been taken. Man is faced with another being capable of doing everything that man used to do, but with greater speed, accuracy, etc. The presentation in Rorvik's book is characteristic. Evolution, he says, passes from the amoeba to man through progressive animal mutations, then from man to the computer, which is simply a final stage of evolution. However, the computer must replace man as the king of creation. The machine is intelligent. There is no limit to its intelligence. And in visions that he wants to present as scientific, Rorvik describes all the possibilities of the computer: total automation of factories, the computer's aptitude for learning spontaneously, for programming itself. Computers have personalities, they have mental crises, they feel friendship, dislike, affection, they can do very flexible tasks. They can create music or poetry, teach, deduce, direct a psychoanalysis, treat an illness. As for the machines that can translate, pass legal judgments, read and use any text, etc., Rorvik feels that they already exist. And in support of his opinion, he cites hundreds of statements by experts, without, however, giving any exact references. Countless examples of such fantasies turn up in Elghazi, Le Desordinateur. This interpretation of the phenomenon is practically rubber-stamped by Bone. The machine lives and thinks. He, too, envisages a close symbiosis between the computer and man, taking into account the computer's ultimate autonomy. The machine thoroughly explores the attributes characterizing those two functions. But it lives and thinks in its own fashion, filling the classical conceptual framework with new potentialities and autonomous meanings. This affirms the power of a creative thinking of its own norms, literally establishing a new world full of noise and sense. Human behavior, such as voluntary mobility, the mnemonic process, evaluating a random situation, are favorably simulated by those apparatuses and mechanically explained. These apparatuses no longer mimic life and thought. They actually live and think, faster and better than man in the silence of passions and feelings that prevent us from living. It is clear that Bone was deeply impressed by John von Neumann's celebrated opus, The General and Logical Theory of Automata in the World of Mathematics, IV, 1956. From which he quotes the part about the robot's ability to reproduce itself. Neumann shows how a self-reproducing system can theoretically exist. A reproduction that, moreover, would be totally lucid and self-aware, the opposite of biological reproduction, which always partially involves contingency. Neumann shows how, in the system he describes, an instruction will function as a father. The copying mechanism will perform the basic act of reproduction, duplication of genetic material, and one of the subsystems in the ensemble will even introduce arbitrary changes. Nevertheless, without going into an overall critique, I am obliged to state that throughout Neumann's description, there is a mysterious one who supplies programs, instructions, who puts automaton A in contact with automaton B, etc. In other words, so that the computer may be capable of a self-reproduction, it must be programmed to that end. And thus, I do not see the idea of self-reproduction anywhere. But still, Bohn will not hesitate to speak of the initiative of the computer, of an artificial model of human thought, of an electronic brain, which links up with Kufignal's machine à penser, thinking machine. In regard to this entire trend, I would like to point out that all the works giving the computer the power of identifying with man, only better, and a sort of total possibility, are old. One exception, however, is W. Skivington's Machina Sapiens, 1976. There are no recent works, aside from writings that are totally second-hand. 49 now, it is well known that right up to about 1963, there was infatuation and enthusiasm among the specialists. Anything was possible thanks to the computer. For the last 10 years, however, we have had a period of wavering criticism, uncertainty. It must be said that one cannot be sure of what is actually gained thanks to the computer. Some people assert that medical diagnosis is already being applied with success. Others, on the contrary, maintain that all the present-day attempts are disappointing. The translating machine, it exists and is being used. But we are told by El-Ghazi, Vaca, and even Moles that it is a complete flop. The machine furnishes translations that are perfectly unintelligible, just as the teaching machines or chess-playing machines are still in the realm of fancy. As for demonstrating theorems, these theorems were all known. The computer has not advanced mathematics by even one jot. Regarding the possibility of having the computer learn autonomously and on the basis of its previous experience, it is, as Vaca says, a matter of definitions. One can program computers to react to signals from the outer world and to put those signals to their own use. The computer can work out statistics on the behavior of the surrounding milieu and, in terms of results, orient the apparatuses that are placed under its control. But there is no way that the computer can furnish an optimal reaction to events that were not foreseen by the programmer. 50. Quite plainly, the tales about the computer feeling pleasure, affection, and whatnot are stupid. The word psychosis pops up when the machine goes out of order, and the word love when the machine responds better to its habitual programmer, who quite simply knows its possibilities better. Is there even a shadow of resemblance between the machine and the brain, between the mechanism and the mind? It is quite fundamental to realize first that the functioning of the human brain is essentially of a non-formal type. 51. By a route which is in no wise comparable to thinking, the computer can achieve a certain number of results that man achieves with the mind. But in human thinking, there is always a share of surprise and unpredictability, which are inaccessible to the computer. Furthermore, the human world is not an exclusively rational world. It is just marvelous to hear someone peacefully declare that passions and feelings prevent us from living. I would rather not discuss it. However, for a still undetermined time, we are going to be creatures of passion, suffering, joy, hope, despair. Hence, the decisions we have to make cannot disregard that fact. They must include factors strictly inaccessible to the computer. Man must reach decisions, albeit with incomplete information. And even if he has complete information, he has to add irrational factors. To decide about a war, who can measure in advance a panic affecting an entire population and blocking the army, like France in 1940? A decision reached by man is never, not because of his incapacity, incompetence, inadequacy, the solution to a problem which the computer is able to supply. A human decision is the breaking of a Gordian knot, which the computer is unable to do. The logical process is merely one part of decision-making, because the world in which a decision is to be integrated is itself not rational. Hence, one cannot imagine a perfection of the computer, which is able to do anything and ultimately will replace man. Likewise, El-Ghazi can accurately say that the intrinsic feature of the human mind is not making calculations, but knowing that it is making calculations and knowing what they signify. and this is something the computer will never achieve. In these conditions, what is the true role of the computer outside the parcellary functions that are often described: gathering, storing, transmitting data, and the equally parcellary application areas? In reality, it is the computer that allows the technological system to definitively establish itself as a system. First of all, it is the computer that allows the large subsystems to organize. For example, the urban system can close itself up only because of the urban data banks, census results, building permits granted, housing already built or under construction, water, telephone, power, transportation, and other networks. Likewise, the air communication system can function only due to computers, given the complexity, the very rapidly growing number of problems sparked by the multiplication of transportation, combined with the technological progress in those areas. It is not only the oft-mentioned booking of seats, but also, for instance, the permanent relationship of each airplane, at every moment, to a huge number of control centers on the ground. The computer also makes possible the large accounting units, that is, the infrastructure for an unlimited growth of economic and even administrative organizations. Would it help to recall the importance of the computer as a memory for scientific work? It is the only solution for preventing the researcher and the intellectual from being swamped by documentation. The major part of a scientist's time goes for bibliographical research. The present world has over 100,000 purely bibliographical works, all listed in a second-degree bibliography, the world bibliography of bibliographies. In other words, it is the computer that will allow the scientific subsystem to finally organize itself efficiently by that very use, as well as by registering discoveries, innovations, inventions, etc. And only the computer will permit adapting administrative subsystems, public utilities, businesses, etc. to the population growth. But of course, we must, in any event, remember that the computer can operate only on very great numbers. It is ridiculous using it largely, as is the case, for medium-sized businesses or for a small institute with a tiny staff of researchers. Most computers that I know of are underemployed by groups who fail to realize, as Font and Quinius so well put it, that the computer is a bulldozer, and using it to dig in a garden is inconceivable. One has no grasp of what a computer really is if one thinks of it as doing a bookkeeper's job more swiftly. Fez has clearly shown that, for example, the entire administrative system would have to be modified in terms of such equipment. In the administrative subsystem, it is a factor of knowledge and education, a demand that the administrators rigorously conceptualize the problems facing them, but it disturbs the relationships of authority. Politico-administrative decision-making changes its character. The programmer becomes the head of the administrative apparatus. The decision-maker is forced to enter into a dialogue and can no longer maintain his status on a legal and hierarchic basis. A total contradiction exists between the rigid status of the officials and the fluidity of the data processing sector. The implementation personnel will tend to disappear. The supervisory personnel's task will consist of relations with the public and forecasting or research. From a structural point of view, the computer transforms the administrative services from parallel to integrated administration. For instance, the personnel salaries, previously taken care of by each ministry for its staff, will henceforth be administered by a single machine belonging to a separate and independent agency. Likewise, there will be an integrated administration of information for all agencies. Moreover, the computer is transforming the procedures and structures of administrative controls by doing away with most of them. It is unifying procedures and concatenating administrative decisions with one another. But this perforce involves new powers of administration, the risk of knowing everything about all the individuals in a nation. Each person will have his dossier containing all the information on him. Finally, computers allow us to organize subsystems by establishing connections and relations among the various parts of that whole. It is obvious that, hitherto, speaking about administration has been an intellectual abstraction. Concretely, there are, in fact, multiple administrations, mutually alien, competitive, guarding their secrets, etc. But this will no longer be possible with the computer. Either it will not be used, or if it is used, people will have to connect the various networks of data and of preparation for administrative decision-making. The point is not so much to link them, as by a sort of interministerial committee, but rather to integrate them. Everything that we have just sketchily reviewed, and that was excellently analyzed by S. Fez, shows that the computer has everywhere the function of integrating the parts of the technological subsystems. For it can validly be employed only where human activities are technological. Otherwise, the area is too vague. Naturally, one can get a computer to paint a picture, but, strictly speaking, this is of no interest aside from curiosity. And when, like moles, one puts the computer into the cultural sector, this either is folklore or signifies the total technicization of the cultural world and its transformation into a technological subsystem. We will study this particular problem when we investigate art in the technological society. The computer can process only technological data, for they are the only decipherable and the only profitable data. That is why it still has a long way to go before entering fully into pure scientific use, which is not profitable despite the celebrated formula of research and development. Nor can the computer enter profitable activities that cannot be reduced to technologies, because they would not be mathematizable. Hence, the computer operates in terms of, and for, subsystems that are technological or that it forces to become technological. There is no other possibility. Yet this integration is all the more powerful in that, naturally, the computer does not remain a solitary crag. The parallel advancement of the various communications technologies is obsolete. Data processing, television, telecommunications get together on more and more projects, which constitute veritable electronic systems of communication, associating audiovisual broadcasting and receiving devices, handling capacity, storage capacity, and long-distance transmitting mechanisms. Instead of computers, television circuits, or telephone networks, we should henceforth speak of electronic communication systems. This specific organism is now the new relationship of the technological subsystems, and is allowed by the foundation of the technological system as a whole. But we should not give in to euphoria, as the Diebold Research Program says, 1971. Far from simplifying technology or business, the computer has increased their complexity, forcing a series of constantly changing restraints upon researchers and managers. Integrating an ensemble into a smoothly working system turned out to be much harder than anyone thought or than the computer manufacturers themselves imagined. Thus, there are incredible difficulties, and no one even knows whether they can be overcome, incredible changes in all existing structures and procedures. So that, as Vaca perfectly emphasizes, people often prefer sticking to the simplistic use of the computer on the lowest level. If the sequential project, the structure and the logic of the system in question have not been satisfactorily defined, if the problems raised by its possible congestion have not been studied, then no appreciable advantage is to be gained from using a computer. If one sets up a computer, and we have seen that this is nothing as yet, without first analyzing the system, one ultimately transfers the strategies and structures of the simplest possible system into the programs of the computer in order not to risk a large-scale failure. Thus, there are systems in which a certain number of processes are run by a computer and which, for that reason alone, are considered modern and efficient, whereas they actually offer highly modest and uninteresting benefits, says El-Ghazi. Using a computer is not enough to make us modern. This leads to an essential discovery. It is utterly vain and futile to speak of the computer as a unity. We have just seen the necessary connection between the computer and telecommunications. But even more, the processes of swift calculating, memory dimension, etc., are quite uninteresting. To consider one computer is to stay on the mental level of the gawker at the county fair who goes to see the basket case or the bearded lady. The computer is not a gadget to do things better and faster. Computers are the correlation factor in the technological system. Until now, the large technological ensembles have had few interrelations. 25 years ago, there was no way to speak of the technological system, because all that could be ascertained was a growth of technology is all areas of human activity. It was an anarchic growth, however. These areas were still kept specific by the traditional division of operations performed by man, and there was no relationship between them. People did look for the technological means to relate them, but they never managed to think of anything but an institutional-type organization, because they knew only of an institutional method to create procedures and connections among various agencies and separate areas of activity. Hence, what we had was a procedure of external framing and rigid fastening, and that was what kept the technological subsystems from developing in relation to one another. Data processing solves the problem. Thanks to the computer, there emerged a sort of internal systematics of the technological ensemble, expressing itself by, and operating on, the level of information. It is through reciprocal total and integrated information that the subsystems are coordinated. This is something that no man, no human group, no constitution was able to do. The further technicization advanced, the more the technological sectors tended to become independent, autonomous, and incoherent. Only the computer can deal with this, but it is quite obvious that it cannot be one computer. It has to be an ensemble of computers working interrelatedly at all communication points of the system. This ensemble becomes the subsystem of connections between the different technological subsystems. It is, without abusing the simile, like a nervous system of the technological ensemble so long as we avoid any comparison to the composition or operation of the animal nervous system. There are so many cells in the animal brain and so many elements in an electronic storage, a perfectly stupid parallel. The simile works on the level of the fixed functions that are the same. The computer ensemble plays the part of a nervous system in the technological order. All other comparisons are uninteresting. They are childish outbursts or half-baked knowledge. However, the function we are dealing with is so purely technological that man is truly incompetent. Only the technically most perfect and most powerful apparatus could do the job. Thus, the computer performs a task inaccessible to man, and thus, there is no rivalry between them. The ideology that sees the robot as a servant or rebel, or the computer as ultimately replacing man in the evolution of creatures, is a bunch of fancies proving that the people who talk about the computer haven't the foggiest notion of what a computer is, and approach it through anthropomorphism. It is not enough to say that the computer can do this or that. All this talk is nonsense. The sole function of the data processing ensemble is to allow a junction, a flexible, informal, purely technological, immediate and universal junction of the technological subsystems. Hence, we have a new ensemble of new functions from which man is excluded, not by competition, but because no one has so far performed those functions. This does not, of course, imply that the computer eludes man, but rather, a strictly non-human ensemble is establishing itself. When the parcellary technicization of tasks occurred, we gradually took on dimensions, e.g., of production, that required new organization. Man still knew how to manage that. Large-scale organization was made possible by the technologies of organization. But with the technicization of all activities and with the growth of all technologies, we are at present faced with a blockage, a state of disorder, because the things now taking place, in quantity, complexity, and speed, are no longer of a human dimension. No organization can operate satisfactorily anymore. The computer phenomenon has appeared at precisely this bottleneck. Yet so far, man has failed to see what this phenomenon demands or allows. It is the technological order, proceeding by more information and letting the technological subsystems adapt as a result of that information, which emanates from what has become the new environment. The ensemble of the operation takes place strictly above our heads, even if man programs a computer, and then another computer, and still another. For this is no longer where the problem lies. Either we are going to keep using computers as calculating machines, in which case we can say that they are useless, and all the criticism by El-Ghazi, Vaca, and Quiniu is accurate, and we can poke fun at those machines. Or else the technological system is powerful enough to impose that veritable and unique service of the data processing complex, and we will then witness the concrete establishing of the technological system as made possible by correlation and integration. A system in which we will see the internalization and reciprocal integration of technological functions, as well as the creation of a virtual universe, virtual because it is totally made up of communications, possessing its own dynamics. The technological system will then be complete. It is not complete as yet, but the complex of computers makes this possible. If one wishes to understand what the computer is, and not describe data processing technologies or list parcellary possibilities, then one can reach such understanding exclusively from that perspective. Hence, we have to examine the totality of data processing, and not one computer, in its relationship to the overall technological system, and not to man. Any other approach is superficial and condemns man to never understanding his own invention. In point of fact, the computer places us in a radically new situation, of which the seemingly magical applications of that apparatus can give us only a false idea. The computer creates a new reality. The transcription, the perfect transposition taking place through it will devalue any ascertainable reality, always uncertain, fragmentary, subjective for the sake of an overall grasp, that is numerical, objective, synthesized, and imposes itself upon us as the only effective reality. Now this comes not only from the impressive efficiency of the apparatus, but also from our own gradually acquired disposition. For instance, we are getting more and more accustomed to the idea that what we consider reality, even tangible reality, is, in fact, nothing but the projection on a cultural pattern of a reality that we will never grasp in itself. Everything we know is the effect of a cultural training that makes us see or hear certain things, which, incidentally, have no objectivity. We are at present living in that uncertain universe, but along comes a rigorously objective and neutral organism and offers us a transposition which seems certain because it is mathematical. How can we help but believe that this image is resolutely true? The computer, even if programmed by someone in a definite culture, is not a tributary to our cultural clouds. And the other mental pole that helps us to enter this computer reality is, of course, our habit of translating the world in which we live into numbers, or even viewing it in terms that are infinitely huge, the galaxies, or infinitely small. It is probably the latter element that is the more decisive. When told that the wood we touch is made of empty spaces and atoms whirling at unbelievable speeds, when told that all our solid environment is actually menaced by antimatter, that energy and mass are interchangeable, we insert ourselves into an abstract universe. The reality surrounding us is neither meaningful nor assured, and all we can be certain about is numbers, for they at least are independent and autonomous. Hence, we are ready to lend reality to the universe manufactured by the computer, a universe that is both numerical, synthetic, nearly all-inclusive, and indisputable. We are no longer capable of relativizing it. The view that the computer gives us of the world we are in strikes us as more true than the reality we live in. Over there, at least, we hold something indisputable, and we refuse to see its purely fictive and figurative character. We will plunge into a new chasm if we start imagining that somebody could have falsified any of the data calculated by the computer, could have modified the program unbeknownst to us. Whatever the hazard, the result is deemed good. And how can we prove that the computer is wrong? For even if we point out one of those errors that can be easily made fun of, It does not challenge the overall fact that the numerical universe of the computer is gradually becoming the universe that is regarded as the reality we are integrated in. 52. As for the mutation of reasoning, of man's thinking, a change which all this implies, I cannot now take up the specific conflict between image and word, which we will come to later. But I should perhaps note an interesting point. To the extent that there will be a more than complete integration between man and computer, we must understand that this integration will exclude dialectical thinking, dialectical reasoning, and dialectical apprehension of reality. The computer is fundamentally non-dialectical. It is based on the exclusive principle of non-contradiction. With the binary system, a choice must be made. It is constantly yes or no. One cannot launch into a thinking that is evolutive and embraces opposites. Such thinking can, plainly, make use of the computer's data, but it is necessarily led by the computer to choices. And there is no maximum use of the computer. It will remain underemployed. If the instrument must be employed to its full capacity, then dialectical thinking becomes impossible. We have to admit that the computer is both Manichean, repetitive, and non-comprehensive. Now, after prolonged dealings with this marvelous apparatus, how can we help but get involved again in that mode of thinking? Man is only all too spontaneously given to it, and dialectical thinking will be done away with by a complicity between man and the apparatus. Thus, the existence of the system considerably transforms the judgments we can make of the facts, the parcellary technological discoveries. Indeed, we are convinced that, when presented with a new factor, we are free to choose to adopt or reject it. We try to appreciate the pill, the car, the spaceship, marketing, video, and we note that each new element brought by technology could be an extra element of freedom, but also, of course, an element of dictatorship. What a constantly renewed choice! Unhappily, this choice is never offered, because each new technological element is merely one more brick in the entire edifice, a cog in a machine, coming just in time to perform a function never before carried out, to fill a space that, we now realize, was a gap. The system magnetically attracts that technological unity to come and make up the deficiency, and that attraction in advance gives that apparatus, that method, a clear, precise, exact, and limited function from which it is impossible to depart. And in the face of that attraction, the scant freedom of man is neither far-reaching nor effective. Thus, it is perfectly futile to claim that when the computer is applied to the political dimension, it can become an organism of decentralizing, diffusing, of individual scaling of all information, of facilitating political controls. All that is a utopia, meant simply to reassure us, and thereby allow the data processing system to establish itself. We are dealing here with a factor of paramount importance. Man simply refuses to see the process, and by posing the question in metaphysical and absolute terms, he convinces himself that everything is still possible, that from the standpoint of Sirius, the new technological factor is liberating. Thus appeased, he then lets the mechanism progress, and afterwards, when he sees the result, he can say, "But that wasn't at all what we envisaged, anticipated, etc." The harm is done. The optimism of the liberating pill, or the democratizing computer, is a mere operation of unintentional anesthetizing. If it weren't for a political system centralizing everywhere, including China, if it weren't for the class of technicians holding power, if it weren't for a technological system arranged in a precise way, if, in other words, the computer appeared in a desert at point zero of a society, then it could be a factor of individual progress. But none of these conditions obtains. The computer has entered a perfectly oriented system. It will not, by itself, bring any democratizing or decentralizing. On the contrary, it will accentuate the opposite trends. Allen F. Weston, Privacy and Freedom, 1967, has perfectly analyzed the effects of the computer on freedom. The countless dossiers assembled by the individual bureaucracies for their own use can now be gathered in one central computer. All the information on each individual can be united, with a luxury of detail that we can scarcely picture, all legal infractions, all medical operations, all bank transactions, etc. Confronted with this, people are suggesting legal regulation of the use of these files, legislation to respect privacy, etc. In other words, all they have come up with is a set of utterly antiquated defenses, the law, which was helpless against the authoritarian state. Moreover, these judicial means provided by the administration will be controlled by the state. That is, the only thing the protection of privacy will hinder is the interference by one individual in the life of another. But how can we believe that the authorities who control the apparatus and its use will themselves obey the same prohibition? They will always be in a position to decide whether or not to employ this gigantic system of control. Quis custodiet custodem. It has been proposed that the guardian be the people, but in that case, the central computer would have to be made available to individuals, who would then be able to use it against other individuals. There is no way out. There is no chance that judicial supervision of the computer can be useful. If the central government is honest, respectful of individuals, decentralizing, democratic, and above all, if it is not forced to defend itself, e.g., against revolutionaries, then we do not need any law. The government will not utilize this instrument of matchless power. Otherwise, the government will bypass the legal restrictions and enter the area of pure de facto interference. There is no protection. And the computer is moving in the direction already established by the ensemble of the system. 53. In other words, this view of technology as a system leads to an essential conclusion. It is absolutely useless to regard one technology or one technological effect separately. It makes no sense at all. Anybody doing that has simply no understanding of what technology is all about, and he will find lots of cheap consolations. And that is the most common error I find in practically all writings on technology. The authors wonder if we can change the use of the automobile, or if TV has a bad effect, etc. But this is meaningless, because TV, for instance, exists only in terms of a technological universe, as an indispensable distraction for people living in this universe, and as an expression of this universe. It is not raw or cultural per se because it quite simply does not exist in and of itself. It is TV plus all the rest of the technological actions. To my knowledge, no author has escaped this convenient parceling. And naturally, if one focuses on the harmful effects of some aspect of the system, one can easily demonstrate that we can overcome them and redirect the apparatus causing them. But those harmful effects do not exist per se. That is why all the solutions proposed by specialized books are anything but solutions. Features of the system. The first feature, so obvious that we will not dwell on it, is that the system itself is composed of subsystems. Rail, postal, telephone, and air systems, a production and distribution system for electric power, industrial processes of automated production, an urban system, a military defense system, etc. These subsystems were organized without long-term planning. They were organized, adapted, and modified step by step, in response to demands made by, e.g., the growth in size of these subsystems and the gradually emerging relationships to the other subsystems. Sometimes, people have tried to thoroughly reorganize such an ensemble from square one. But it must be noted, such attempts work less and less because each ensemble is now tied up with and conditioned by the others. Each one keeps losing its flexibility, as it turns out more and more to be a mere subsystem of the overall technological system. Nothing can be done about them spontaneously. These large subsystems have become so complex that everything has to pass through an analysis of the objectives, the structure, the flow of information from the ensemble. This analysis requires that the objectives be redefined in a formal and mathematizable way, that the logic of the ensemble be made clear, decisions on what must happen to each element in each situation it may go through during a process of complete functioning. In other words, we must establish what we would like to see happen in all the possible eventualities of every telephone call, every train, every aircraft, etc., and their history must be determined and controlled by the system. Once the functions of each subsystem have been defined in detail, we still have to define the structure, e.g., problems of centralization-decentralization, and the internal controls. We must therefore be cognizant that the technological system is neither abstract nor theoretical. It is merely the result of the interrelationship between these multiple subsystems, and it functions only to the extent that each of these subsystems functions, and that their interrelationship is correct. If a short circuit occurs among them, or if something goes wrong within any subsystem, then the entire ensemble is blocked. This is what leads Vacca to his theory on the fragility of the great technological ensembles. The second feature of the overall system is its flexibility. What we have just said would make it appear enormously rigid, and indeed, the imperatives are more and more numerous and demanding. But it seems that while this may be true for each subsystem, the ensemble per se tends to function more flexibly, and the strength and stability of technology reside in that ability to adapt. This is an apparent contradiction, resulting from different levels of analysis, which produces the conflict between the two interpretations. No doubt, M. Crozier is right when he maintains, the stalled society, that the great modern organizations seem to be evolving solely toward oppressiveness. The constant improvement in forecasting methods allows a greater exercise of tolerance in the application of rules. The organization can operate with a lower degree of conformity. Knowledge permits limiting the constraint, since one can forecast without taking recourse to constraint in order to assure the accuracy of forecasts, etc. But one can say that the better adapted man is, the more tolerant and liberal the system can act toward him. The more he conforms, the less constraint has to be used. Now the technological system produces more and more efficient mechanisms to bring about conformity. It can offer a huge measure of independence so long as human action does not challenge the system. The system tends to be more and more abstract and to establish itself at a second or third degree. Hence, the primary and superficial conformisms may disappear. Man seems to acquire far greater freedom. He can listen to the music he likes, dress as he likes, take on completely aberrant religious beliefs or moral attitudes. None of these things challenge the technological system. The technologies even produce the means of these diversifications for man. But these diversifications exist only to the extent that the technologies function, and the latter function only to the extent that the technological system keeps improving. It is a mistake made by many thinkers like Charles Reich or Onimus to see increased liberty here 54, or a challenge to the system by free behaviors, or the emergence of a new phenomenon independent of technology. In reality, these motions of independence are strictly dependent, but technology leaves zones of indifference that keep getting wider as technology gets more self-assured. It is clear that social conformities are all the less apparently intense in that the technological conformities have become interiorized and are no longer obvious, for the social structure has become more technological. Conformity to technology is now the true social conformity. The technological system omits from its scope things that used to be the object of great concern by society, e.g., the identity of moral conducts. That is why we have to avoid posing the present-day problems in classical moral terms. For instance, to talk of liberty or responsibility in the technological system is meaningless. Those are moral terms that are incapable of taking man's actual situation into account. It is, however, true that the technological system appears to give man a larger choice of possibilities, but exclusively within this technological range, and on condition that the choices bear upon technological objects, and that this independence employs the technological instruments, i.e., expresses approval. The flexibility we are discussing concerns not only the apparent independence of man, it is also, and quite concretely this time, a feature of the system with respect to the subsystems. The subsystems have an independence that often causes them to be considered in themselves, i.e., as having their own existence unrelated to technology, their own originality, hence origin, and their own laws of functioning with no reference to technology. This is held to be true of culture or religion or organization, etc., whereas all these things have become part of the technological system, with a very large flexibility in their relations. People who thus consider the autonomy of the subsystems have often made the mistake of finding, or hoping to find, a remedy for technology in those subsystems. I have shown elsewhere that organization is not a remedy for technology but a further step in building the technological system. For a good example of this seeming independence of subsystems, one can look at S. Charbonneau's study, Regionalisme et Société Technicienne, Cahiers du Baucau, 1973. Regionalist theories all have the same function, to refine or justify the reductive dynamics of differences. Regionalism is a product of the technological society, despite the contrary appearances, which make technology out to be always centralizing. Technology can also be decentralizing so long as the decentralized factor is more strongly integrated into the system itself. In this way, regionalism can be an aspect of technocracy, although presenting itself as an application of liberalism. That is why the discussion about and referendum on regionalism in France during these past few years have no importance whatsoever. The regional reform will be a seeming gain of autonomy, permitting greater technological strides. Such administration is more in keeping with technological growth than authoritarian centralism, which is now obsolete. The more complex and total the technological system gets, the more it has to be flexible. This is quite clear. A large number of disorders that we presently ascertain derive from rigidities in the system. No chaos is provoked by technology. There is still a rigid centralized organization, which can only cause incoherences, given the size. But, as we have seen, technology has the apparatus for allowing the flexibility of the whole, namely, the computer. The computer permits the shift from a formal and institutional organization to a relationship by means of information, and the dynamic structure according to flows of information. Flexibility also allows keeping cultural diversities where centralization has not yet taken place. To be sure, there is still a Khmer or a Sahelian culture. Those are survivals fully tolerated by technology, but classified by it as leftovers from the past, folklore, the living museum of the anthropologist. Those cultures are a semblance covering the reality of a ubiquitously similar technological system, but with different degrees of advancement. And when there is a risk of conflict, the local culture disappears, for example, in a war, when technology presents its most brutal and ruthless side. In general, however, technology is flexible enough to carefully adapt to local conditions. I have already shown this in my previous book. Hence, let us say that the cultural diversities bear witness to the flexibility of the system, but do not prove that the human realities are outside it. The same is true of time. Richter is perfectly correct in emphasizing that the basic feature of technological growth is the economy of time. It acts upon time. It produces time to the detriment, one I could say, of space. It creates time for man while reducing space. Hence the gratuitous and purely utopian character of Lefebvre's thesis that the important thing now is to create space. Heading in his direction, one can only go astray in the slough of unreal discourse. On the other hand, Richter sees clearly when he writes, "The economy of time is presumed to become the adequate economic form of the scientific and technological revolution at a certain degree of development. Civilization at the Crossroads, 1969." And he tries to draw from this principle a new economic rationality, which differs from all the other types known. But the problem is that this economy of time cannot be ascertained in an industrialist system, and is meaningless if it boils down to leisure. It makes sense only in respect to the technological system itself, i.e., as Richter shows, if the economized time ultimately serves for an improved training of men to work toward technological and scientific development in an integrated culture. A third feature, and an utterly essential one, is that the technological system itself elaborates its own processes of adaptation, compensation, and facilitation. Let us consider, in fact, that, speaking very generally, the processes of adaptation are technologies. Whenever technology creates, say, desperate social situations because of the complexity, the demands which make countless young, old, and semi-capable people powerless and marginal, etc., the free motion of technologies, it instantly establishes a social service, technologies of prevention, adaptation, readjustment, etc. These are actually technologies and hence represent the system, being meant to facilitate life in this inhuman universe. Thus, an ensemble of reparation technologies is formed. 55. Because of these technologies, man can succeed in having a pleasant and livable life. But this is nothing more than substituting an artificial system and a technological faithfulness for the old natural system and the faithfulness of the gods. There is no retort, no original invention by man. In reality, the facilitation is always produced by technology itself. It is technology that furnishes gadgets, television, travel, to make up for a colorless, adventureless, routine existence. Likewise, the mass production of wretched science fiction books or movies like Alphaville, 2001, Fahrenheit 451, is a mechanism for adapting, for adjusting to the technological society as it really is. We are shown a horrible, unacceptable model, which we forcefully reject. But it is not technology, it is an imaginative treatment of what technology could be. And in our refusal, our rejection, our condemnation of this, we think we have waved off technology. Hence, we must be lucid and vigilant beings. We are rid of our anxiety. Technology, this technology, will not seize control of us. We are very cognizant and we will not be gotten the better of. Now this facilitates the acceptance of real technology, which is neither wicked, visible, nor appalling, but utterly gentle and benign. Since technology is nothing like what it has been shown to be, it strikes us as perfectly acceptable and reassuring. We take refuge in the real technological society in order to escape the fiction that was presented as the true technology. This is why I am resolutely hostile to all these anti-technological novels and films. They are never anything but that old military trick. You simulate a massive attack with trumpets and lights so as to divert the attention of the men defending the citadel, while the real operation, digging up a mine, for instance, takes place somewhere else and in a very different way. Countless other adaptation processes appear, and we may say that the entire phenomenon of Charles Reich's consciousness III is nothing but a method of adjusting to the new stage of the technological society. Consciousness II was adapting to the industrial technological society, consciousness III to the technological society of the computer. Nothing more, because consciousness III brings no reversal of the social process. On the contrary, it is bound up with the most modern production. Reich is ecstatic because engineers sport bell-bottoms and long hair. The important thing for me is that, as engineers, they are still doing their engineering work exactly as they did before, and hence, they directly make this technological society continue and progress. The rest is childish, a pitiful affirmation of personality. When faced with difficulties of human adjustment, the technological system produces satisfactions and compensations, facilitating the growth and functioning of the system. Likewise, it now presents demands which can appear as possibilities for personality development. Crozier, in The Stalled Society, very accurately points out that, in order to cope with technological growth, there will have to be more invention, creation, nonconformity, and challenge. Creativity and nonconformity are fundamental values in the technological society. Indeed, for its progress, this society requires not passiveness but an enthusiastic approval of change. It is technology that demands an assault on the old values, on morals and traditional ethics. The challenger opens the way for technological strides. Creativity is called upon because whenever technology advances, forms of life that are possible in technology must be invented. But it is wrong to believe that there is true creativity. This relates only to technology, true nonconformity. It expresses merely a conformity to the deeper and stronger reality. When I speak of conformism and Crozier of nonconformism, we are simply not on the same level of analysis. It is certain that by progressing non-stop, technology challenges the old structures and values, and incites man to create whatever allows him to live in this environment. But this is never anything but conformity, and creativity will produce the countless gadgets. Those bell-bottoms so dear to the heart of Charles Reich are an essential product of this adaptable creativity. Likewise, an altruistic ideology will see the light of day, neo-Christianism for others, or the ideology of socialism with a human face. The more truly oppressive the system gets, the more man has to compensate by affirming his independence. The more destructive the system gets toward human relations, the more man has to aver himself an altruist, which Baudrillard is perfectly correct in labeling a social lubrication. Once this altruism leaves the verbal and institutionalized domain, it will itself become very quickly technicized. One should not view the technological system as manufacturing human robots. On the contrary, it develops those things on which we make our humanity most strongly dependent: diversity, altruism, nonconformity. But they are perfectly integrated into the system itself. That is to say, they function for the benefit of the system, supplying it with new nourishment and making one another materialize thanks to what the system furnishes. Thus, the need for play, which is discovered to be so fundamental to a human being, is put to use by the technological system. Man has a wonderful time playing with all the machines at his disposal, and this playing will be so much more exciting because of technicity. Thus, similarly, the technological system has allowed man to rediscover the refined techniques of sexual play, which, however, are nothing but technologies. I realize I may be asked, but if man can develop all his potentials through technology, what more do you want? A tough question to answer. How can we point out that highly technicized sex is not love, that playing with complex or fascinating apparatuses is not equivalent to a child's playing with bits of wood, that the nature reconstituted by technology is not nature, that functionalized nonconformity is not existential? In other words, that all those things make us live in a universe of facticity, illusion, and make-believe. I always come back to the example of the Nazi soldier at the start of the war. He was trained for individual initiative, for non-servility toward commanders, for the capacity to take over an enterprise himself, and he therefore seemed the opposite of the mechanized soldier, who is at his sergeant's beck and call. But this freedom existed only within the army. He was not free to desert. It was meant to turn out better fighters within the Nazi ideology, and it was achieved by extreme psychological manipulation. Such is the creativity, the nonconformity of man inside the technological society. They are now necessary conditions for the development of the system, nothing more. The essential here has been said by B. Charbonneau, le chaos et le système. The cog is the antithesis of the human person. The latter is a universe turned toward the universe, the former an inert piece that only an outer force can situate in the ensemble. For we are not just dealing with man's absorption into technology. The system has been able to develop all the better in that technology has been assimilated by and to groups that have identified with it. People would have realized the danger more quickly if the professional organisms in charge of technologies had understood what was happening, if they had managed to reflect on what they were doing. In contrast, however, for reasons of both ideology, beliefs, etc., and personal interest, success, money, they fully identified with technology. And it was even the strength of these groups of technicians that allowed the predominance of technology and its organization into a system. It was also the stranglehold of these groups on society that blocked the first intellectuals aware of the danger. I am thinking of the mathematician Cournot, who, in his Considérations sur la marque des idées et des événements dans les temps modernes, 1872, was probably the first to understand and expose the vast danger of not only mechanization but technology as well. A good deal later, Adams, The Degradation of Democratic Dogma, 1919, saw the consequences of technology with an extreme lucidity. The voices of these scientists were muffled by the existence of the pressure group of technicians and scientists, which Galbraith clarified in the new industrial state. The group of technicians is perfectly integrated into the technological system and acts as a relay between technology and society. Kuhn took up and deepened these ideas for science by showing that science exists only because of a sociological group of scientists who provide its tendency and its clarification. The identification of the scientist with science is accompanied by the identification of science with the scientist. And the defense of the technological system occurs when technology is defended by a social group that defends itself by defending technology, which is the group's raison d'être, justification, livelihood, its way of gaining prestige, etc. One of the compensatory processes is the development of language. It is absolutely essential to understand that in this proliferation of things that invade him because of technology, man reacts by throwing himself toward the verbal universe, and the word becomes all the more important as things become more overwhelming. We find the same verbal magism in the past, when man was in the midst of a nature that he did not control. Holding the word that represented the thing was having power over the thing. Thus today, since he no longer controls the technological universe, man has abandoned his rationality and gone back to the magic of the word in the face of, and upon, the technological thing. But though the use may be the same, there has to be a difference because of context. Language has to take on an objectivity, permitting it to correspond to the objectivity of the technological system. Now this is certainly magism, for verbal magic too was the objectivation of the formula so that it might act upon the objectivity of the natural environment. The one, the it, the field, all laconism, etc., is purely and simply magism, just as incidentally the style of Lacan and of so many other writers is very significantly sheer incantation. It is a mechanical expression of the compensatory reaction by the technological system. But on the other hand, language must itself be integrated into the system in order to play its role. Hence, the structuralist studies of language, which are precisely characteristic of that technicization. Hence, likewise, the trend toward viewing the text as an entity in itself, an object, and the orientation toward focusing on how one says something rather than on what one says, in order to demonstrate technologically. Here, Roland Barthes is very directly one of the reducers of language to its function of compensating for the technological system. The technological system produces its own compensations. It reproduces its conditions for existing and developing. The qualities of man are part of it. This is simply a way of removing an obstacle to development and reducing the contradictions. For the system obeys a law, the law of the indefinite evolution of technology. The system cannot stabilize, contrary to the image that certain people have of it. It includes within itself its own expansion. It is a permanently expanding system. But this expansion therefore keeps challenging both the adaptation of man and of institutions and society to which we will return, and the very structure of the system itself. However, technology is a flexible ensemble that tends to endlessly reproduce its own reorganization. Otherwise, it would not be technology. A bit like a doll with a lead base, you can push it down and rock it, but it always regains its balance, though in a different place from before. Thus, technology contains within itself its own processes of reorganization, for it is precisely a technological organization. Any challenge to, any disturbance in the system is nothing but a provocation, a solicitation to have new technologies, new organizations, new procedures established, each time integrating a larger amount of data, its quantity unlimited thanks to the computer. And this does not take place against man or to control or dominate him. The system has no intention and no objective. It merely rolls along. and its servants are quite convinced that they are working for the good of man. They are inspired by the best intentions, which makes the technological system more and more humanized. But through the absorption of the human into technology, any other process is unthinkable. 56. The absence of feedback we have just said that technology produces, for man's benefit, compensations for harmful effects, that it produces facilitations for itself, and that it can change character, decentralization. Yet it appears more and more that this system does not have one of the characteristics generally regarded as essential for a system. Feedback, i.e., the mechanism intervening when an ensemble, a system in movement, makes a mistake, and rectifying that error but acting at the source, at the origin of the movement. There is no reparation of the mistake in its functioning. The movement is taken back to its origin, modifying a given in the system. Feedback exists not only in mechanical, artificial systems, but also in biological or ecological systems. It involves a checking of the results, followed by a rectification of the process when the checked results are injurious or unsatisfactory. Now the technological system does not tend to modify itself when it develops nuisances or obstructions, etc. This system is given to pure growth, hence it causes the increase of irrationalities. Also, it is clumsy and lacks fluidity. When disorders and irrationalities are noted, they bring nothing but compensatory processes. The system continues to develop along its own line. The rigidities themselves are very slow, not only by a mechanical effect as in population, but also by the appearance of necessity in the technological operation. When we see that the housing built according to the most economical technological standards is disastrous from a sociological or psychological standpoint, we nevertheless go with the momentum. We cannot turn back. The same kind of housing has been put up for 20 years now because it is impossible to take the technological issue back to square one with the enormous complex of decisions, devices, etc. Likewise, when an operation is launched, it has to be pushed to its end, even when we realize how disastrous it is. On two very different levels, taken from among 1,000 examples, the Concorde and the garbage incinerating factory at Pau. In reality, for a system on so vast a scale to have a self-regulating behavior, its reactions would have to be based on a model of its relations with the environment which gives it continuous instructions. We find such a model in the traditional societies with, for instance, the view of the world accepted by all members of that society, its religion, its Weltanschauung, its traditional laws, etc. But the technological system does not have such a system because of its absolute domination over the environment. It evolves by its own logic. Yet we should not go so far as to believe that technology cannot resolve the difficulties it creates. We have to distinguish, as J. Bowley Bennett does, between micro-problems and macro-problems. Here, by way of example, is his list: job-related difficulties, work, free time, unemployment, the subordination and alienation of workers, the transition from capitalism to socialism, pollution, population growth. Those are a certain number of problems caused by technology and which it could probably solve. I will not join him in labeling them micro-problems, for they are tremendous. We shall see that technological progression is due to coping with those difficulties. And to the extent that technology is also an ideology, it leads, as J. Habermas shows, to replacing purely practical issues with technological problems, but on condition that we take practical in Habermas's sense. The state, for instance, shifts from politics to administrative and technological management. However, there are other problems which have no chance, no likelihood of a technological solution. Take, for instance, the totalitarian character of the system, the indefinite complexification, the reconstitution of the destroyed human environment, the search for the quality of life, the tendency toward dislocation caused by the disappearance of qualitative controls, the reckoning of costs, the external economic costs, the denaturalization of man with the disappearance of natural rhythms, of spontaneity, of creativity, the incapacity for moral judgment because of power. Those are insoluble problems because, in order to deal with them, it is not enough to overcome drawbacks, to remove a present-day difficulty, to find a way of counteracting a danger. We would have to be able to go back to the source of the technological process to modify the totality of the functioning and the organization. The first category of problems that impels the evolution and expansion of the system is a type that can be put in technological terms, in view of the now existing technologies. That is, these problems are solved in a linear fashion by the very progress of technology. 57. It suffices to let the present combination of elements function in order to get answers to the questions more or less shortly. Whereas in the other cases, we have to make a loop, i.e., double back to the source of the process in order to introduce new information there. But the difficulty is that we are working with the communication of external data. Once again, there is so much talk these days about communication, because in the technological system, communication is essential. We saw earlier that communication is what allows the system to establish itself as such. And now, an impossibility of communication prevents feedback. Feedback is never anything but a matter of communication, albeit the communication of external data. P. Keefe, Blueprint for Survival, p. 57, remarks that technology is devoid of internal regulations. It is in its principle even an abolition of internal limits. If anything is possible, technology will do it. Technology has no internal regulations that can organize inner life. It has nothing to do with inner life except to abolish it. Once reduced to an intellectual model equivalent to the technological model itself, the repression by the forces of technology will inevitably have a tyrannical character. The response would be the reconstitution of a deep-seated ethics, which would itself contain its own organs of command. And Goldsmith, in the same book, makes the same statement. The natural phenomena are capable of self-regulation. Those that create technology ought to be regulated from the outside. When one has used chemical fertilizers, one is doomed to continue. When one has undertaken to get rid of malaria with DDT, one is forced to keep using it year after year if the cleanliness of our waterways depends on purification plants, etc. We are obliged to keep these installations running. In other words, there is no internal control of results, no internal mechanism of regulation, for these results are felt on levels and in areas that are non-technological. The technological system does not function in a void, but in a society and in a human and natural environment. Thus, there are two difficulties. One is to ascertain the qualitative effects of technology in those areas, but that is not in the province of technology. There is a whole set of phenomena that elude all measuring instruments and even the technological imagination itself. But on the other hand, once those phenomena are registered, they have to be reintroduced at the origin of the process. Now we have seen that the electronic complex could register a large amount of this data, but not all, and perform this work of reinserting new information. But the junction between the data processing complex and the rest of the technological system does not come about by some kind of intrinsic growth, by some technological self-development. We are dealing here with an innovation in the technological system. This junction is possible only through human mediation. The computer cannot by itself enter into a relationship with such a sector of technology. It is man who must establish the connection. Of course, what I am saying will not surprise those who have stuck to the ancestral and antediluvian idea that technology is a tool, which man uses as he pleases. The entire technological drama at the moment is heading toward a situation in which technology, having conquered its autonomy and functioning by self-augmentation, could not, on the contrary, have feedback except by outer pressure. Feedback is made possible by the data processing complex, but the relationship has to be mediated by a non-technological element, which runs counter to autonomy and is perfectly unacceptable. It is not only the relationship that depends on man, It is also the reception of this data and its transformation into programs. Hence, the feedback of the technological system necessarily passes through the awareness of the major effects of technology, an awareness reached by man who is integrated in the system. Hence, it could not be enough for man to act with his good sentiments, his moral or humanist ideas, his political convictions, his principles. 58. We cannot appeal to amenity or humility. All this presupposes that man can act directly on the consequences of technology. It is obvious that for those who believe that there are only isolated technological apparatuses, man being master of each, this whole problem of feedback is never raised. All man has to do is wish to change a certain use, and everything will docilely be modified. But we have seen that nothing can now justify this universal royal reign of man. It is not enough for man to have created an apparatus, or to know everything about it in order for all the effects of the apparatus to be perfectly clear to him. We have passed into a phase of technological organization in which man should not interfere. But he cannot help interfering because of that absence of internal regulations, due not to a deficiency in the technological system itself, but to the fact that it functions only by intro-information, data on itself, and never by extra information. Thus, the true problems are on the inside of the system. That is the bottleneck of our situation. The issue is not to make ourselves the masters of technology, which, strictly speaking, is meaningless, nor to have an extra soul. We must be able to integrate into the technological system the qualitative external data capable of modifying the process at its origin. That is where the conflict is located, and not, according to stupid images, in a rivalry between the robot computer and man dispossessed of his brain. We will study this problem in detail in the last part.